3 months after everyone laughed at a teenage girl's backyard fish farm, the entire town was standing outside her house, begging for food. Store shelves were completely empty, prices had skyrocketed overnight, and panic had taken over the streets. But the most shocking part, the only person who seemed prepared for all of this, was a 16-year-old girl nobody ever took seriously. How did she know this was coming? And why did everyone ignore her when it mattered most? To understand that, we have to go back to where it all began. Emily Carter was 16 years old, living in a quiet suburban town just outside Austin, Texas. On the surface, she looked like any other teenager: school in the morning, homework in the evening, and a phone she could barely put down like everyone else. But Emily had something different about her. While most kids her age were obsessed with trends, parties, and social media, Emily was obsessed with something no one around her understood: food systems, sustainability, and fish farming. It all started when she read a documentary report about rising food shortages and unstable supply chains. At first, it was just curiosity, but the more she read, the more uncomfortable she became. Because something in those reports didn't feel like future problems. It felt like warnings, real ones, but whenever she tried to talk about it, people would just laugh. Emily, relax. It's not the end of the world. Why are you thinking about all this survival stuff? Just focus on school like everyone else. But Emily couldn't ignore what she had seen. So one evening, she made a decision that would change everything. She was going to build something real, a small backyard fish farm, not for fun, not for attention, but as preparation. At first, it sounded crazy, even to her own family. Her mother thought it was just a phase. Her father wasn't sure it would even work. And the neighbors? They made it a daily joke. But Emily didn't argue. She didn't try to convince anyone. She just started working. The next morning, while the rest of the neighborhood was still asleep, Emily stepped into her backyard with a shovel in her hands. The ground was dry, uneven, and hard to dig. But she didn't stop. Hour after hour, day after day, she kept digging. And slowly something started taking shape. A small outline in the earth. Space that most people saw as nothing. But Emily saw as possibility. And behind the curtains, people started noticing, not because they believed in her, but because they were waiting for her to fail. The day the construction of the fish farm began to look real, the jokes in the neighborhood got louder. What used to be whispers behind curtains turned into open laughter over fences. Look at her, she's really serious about this. A fish pond in a backyard in Texas. She must think she's building an aquarium or something. Emily heard it all, but she never responded, because by then, she had already learned something important. People will always talk when they don't understand your vision. And most of the time, explaining it only wastes energy. So she focused on building. After weeks of digging, shaping, and preparing the ground, Emily finally reached the next step. Water. She had studied enough to know that a fish farm wasn't just about digging a hole and filling it. It needed structure, filtration, balance, and most importantly, the right start. With the help of her father, she installed a basic water system using pipes, barrels, and filters they could afford. It wasn't fancy, it wasn't professional, but it worked. The day the water finally filled the pond, Emily stood quietly beside it, watching, waiting. It reflected the sky like a mirror. For the first time, it didn't feel like an idea anymore. It felt alive. Then came the fish. Small fingerlings were ordered from a supplier in a nearby county. When the box arrived, Emily carefully opened it with shaking hands. Inside were dozens of tiny fish, barely bigger than her fingers. This was the real beginning. She slowly released them into the water, one by one. And for a moment, everything felt perfect. But reality doesn't stay perfect for long. Within the first week, things started going wrong. Some fish weren't eating properly, the water started turning slightly cloudy. And Emily noticed something that made her stomach drop. A few fish were floating near the surface. Motionless. Dead. She rushed to check everything she had learned from books and online guides. pH levels, oxygen balance, temperature. Something was off, but she couldn't figure out what. Her confidence, which had been growing for months, suddenly cracked. At school the next day she tried to act normal, but rumors had already spread. "Did you hear? Half her fish are dying. I told you this wouldn't work." She wasted all that time for nothing. The words hit harder now, because this time, they weren't just jokes. They were starting to look like reality. That evening, Emily sat alone by the pond. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the water. She looked at the surface. Quiet, still, uncertain. For the first time, doubt entered her mind. Maybe they were right. Maybe she had made a mistake. But then she remembered something she had read long ago. Every system fails before it stabilizes. Every beginning looks like failure before it becomes success. She took a deep breath and made a decision. She wasn't stopping here, no matter what it took, even if she had to rebuild everything from scratch. The night Emily almost gave up stayed with her longer than she expected. She couldn't sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the same image. Still water, floating fish, and the sound of neighbors laughing in her head. But by morning, something inside her had shifted. Fear was still there, but it wasn't in control anymore. It had been replaced by something quieter. Determination. She went straight to the backyard before breakfast. The pond looked the same as it did the night before. But Emily no longer saw failure. She saw a system that needed fixing, not abandonment. She pulled out her notes, her books, and every scrap of research she had collected over months. Then she started again. This time she wasn't guessing, she was diagnosing. The first issue was oxygen. The water wasn't circulating properly, which meant the fish were slowly suffocating. So she built a simple aeration system using a small pump and improvised tubing. Not perfect, but enough to move the water. Next, she tested the water balance again. The pH levels were unstable, too acidic, so she carefully adjusted it using natural methods she had read about, adding materials to stabilize the environment instead of shocking it with chemicals. Every correction was small, but together they started to matter. Day by day, the water began to clear. The fish stopped dying, and slowly they started growing. Emily noticed the change first in the way they moved, more energy, more stability, life returning. For the first time since she started, the pond was working. Not perfectly, but it was alive, and that was enough to keep her going. But while Emily was rebuilding her small ecosystem, something else was happening outside her backyard. The town was changing. At first it was subtle. A slight increase in grocery prices, longer lines at supermarkets, Fewer items on shelves. People blamed it on supply delays, weather issues, transport problems, anything except the truth. But within weeks, subtle turned into serious. Certain products started disappearing completely. Fresh food became expensive. Basic staples became harder to find. And panic, slowly but surely, started creeping into everyday conversations. At school, the mood shifted. Students stopped joking as much. Teachers began talking in worried tones. Parents started comparing receipts and shaking their heads in disbelief. And Emily, she noticed everything, because while others were just now feeling the pressure, she had been reading about this possibility for months. One afternoon, as she stood near the pond, she overheard a conversation between two neighbors outside her fence. They're saying supply trucks are getting delayed again. My grocery bill doubled this week. I don't know how much longer this can go on. Emily didn't react, but something inside her tightened. Not fear, recognition. The warnings weren't theoretical anymore, they were unfolding in real time. And for the first time, her backyard fish farm didn't feel like just a project. It felt like preparation, the kind nobody had taken seriously. Until now. That night, as she checked the pond lights and watched the fish move beneath the surface, Emily made a quiet promise to herself. Whatever was coming next, she would be ready for it. Even if the entire town wasn't. The first real sign that something was seriously wrong didn't come from the news, it came from the grocery store. One morning, Emily's mother came home earlier than usual, holding 2 plastic bags that barely looked full. She placed them on the kitchen counter and just stood there for a moment. Silent. "That's it?" Emily asked. Her mother nodded slowly. Half the things were gone. And what was left was expensive. Emily didn't say anything at first, but she already understood what that meant. The situation wasn't temporary anymore, it was accelerating. Over the next few days, the changes became impossible to ignore. Stores that used to be busy were now overcrowded. Shelves were emptying faster than they could be restocked, and prices were rising almost weekly. People who once joked about food shortages somewhere else were now comparing receipts at checkout counters with worried faces. At school, lunch tables grew quieter. Students brought less food. Some skipped meals entirely. And still, most people refused to believe it was serious. Probably just a shipping delay. It'll go back to normal soon. That's how things always work. But Emily knew better, because she had seen the pattern forming long before anyone else paid attention, and now it was happening exactly as she feared. Meanwhile, her fish farm was no longer struggling. It was stabilizing. The improvements she made in Part 3 had worked. Oxygen levels were balanced. The water was clear. The fish were growing steadily. For the first time, Emily didn't feel like she was fixing problems. She felt like she was maintaining something that actually worked. But success has a strange effect on people watching from the outside. The same neighbors who once laughed were now curious. They started walking slower when passing her house. Some would glance over the fence. Others would stop pretending they weren't looking. Whispers returned. But this time, they sounded different. Is that fish thing actually working? I heard she still has fish alive in there. No way. That was just a phase. But doubt was starting to creep into their confidence because Emily wasn't failing anymore. And people don't know how to react when the person they mocked starts to succeed. One afternoon, a boy from her school walked by her house with 2 friends. He stopped at the fence and looked inside. "What is she even doing in there now?" one of them asked. The boy squinted. "It looks like it's actually working." The others laughed it off, but he didn't move right away. He kept watching the pond. longer than he meant to. Emily noticed them but said nothing. She just kept working, because she had learned something important by now. Attention means nothing. Results mean everything. That evening, she checked the pond again as the sun began to set. The water reflected orange light across the surface. The fish moved in smooth, steady patterns, alive, healthy, growing. For the first time, she allowed herself a small moment of relief. Not victory, just stability. But far beyond her backyard fence, the town was slowly starting to feel something she had been preparing for all along. A pressure that was about to break through the surface. By the time winter approached, the situation in Cedar Creek was no longer concerning. It was unstable, and people could feel it in their daily lives. The grocery store parking lot was fuller than ever, but the shelves inside told a different story. Empty spaces, limited stock, higher prices, and constant frustration. Families started adjusting their routines without even realizing it. Less meat, smaller portions, skipped items they used to buy without thinking. At dinner tables across town, conversations sounded different now. Less about plans, more about cost. Emily noticed all of it, not because she was searching for it, but because she had already expected it. Her fish farm, however, had entered a completely different phase. What once started as a fragile experiment was now becoming a small but stable food source. The fish were healthy, the system was working. And for the first time, Emily even began documenting her progress more seriously. Weights, growth rates, water conditions, harvest cycles. It wasn't just a backyard project anymore, it was becoming a system. But the town still didn't see it that way. To most people, it was still that weird fish thing in Emily's yard. Until the first real shortage hit. One Friday morning, Emily's father came home earlier than usual again. This time his expression was different, tired, serious, concerned. "They limited supply at the store," he said quietly. Emily looked up. "What do you mean limited?" "Certain items, one per family, and some things just weren't there at all." That night the family dinner was quieter than usual. Even the silence felt heavier. Outside, the town was starting to feel something it didn't know how to handle: uncertainty. And uncertainty spreads faster than facts. By the following week, people were lining up earlier at stores, checking deliveries like they were waiting for announcements, talking in anxious tones about what might disappear next. And still, most people refused to connect it to anything permanent until the moment denial stopped working. A second wave of shortages hit harder. More items disappeared completely. Some shelves stayed empty for days, and panic finally started to show its face. Not loud at first, but visible in small ways. Arguments at checkout counters, frustrated customers, empty carts being abandoned halfway through shopping. And through all of it, Emily kept working in her backyard, quiet, focused, watching her system grow while the world outside began to tighten. One evening, as she checked the pond under dim light, she noticed something different. People were no longer just passing by, they were stopping, watching longer, whispering more, and sometimes pointing. She didn't react, but she understood what was happening. Curiosity was turning into attention, and attention was turning into need, because deep down, people were starting to realize something they didn't want to admit. If things kept going like this, they might need exactly what she had been building all along. The day everything finally broke didn't arrive with warning, it arrived with silence. That morning, Cedar Creek felt different. Not louder, not busier, just off. Emily noticed it even before she checked her pond. Her father stood by the kitchen counter longer than usual, staring at his phone. Her mother kept turning the same news headline on and off again. No one spoke for a while. Finally, her father said it. "They're calling it a shortage now." Emily looked up slowly. "Not delays." He shook his head. Shortage. The word landed heavier than anything else had so far. By midday, the grocery store lines stretched outside the building, and when people finally got inside, they found something worse than expected. Empty shelves, not partially empty, not slightly delayed. Empty, completely, rice, flour, canned food, fresh produce, gone faster than they could be replaced. A store employee stood near the entrance repeating the same sentence over and over again. "Please don't panic, we're doing our best." But panic had already started. People were taking more than usual. Some were arguing, some were walking out with whatever they could find, and some were leaving with nothing at all. At school the next day, no one talked about trends or weekend plans. Instead, the conversations were quiet and serious. My mum couldn't find bread. They said delivery got cancelled again. We might have to go to another town just to shop. Emily sat in silence, listening. She didn't look surprised, because in her mind, this wasn't the beginning. It was the confirmation. That evening, she walked through her backyard as the sun lowered behind the houses. The pond looked calm, almost peaceful, but now it meant something different. It wasn't just a project anymore. It was supply, real food, real value, and real potential. She checked the water levels, observed the fish, took notes like she always did, but this time, something felt different in the air. She wasn't alone in noticing it anymore. As she stood near the fence, she heard footsteps pause on the other side. She didn't turn immediately. She already knew people were watching more often now. Whispers had changed. They were no longer jokes. They were questions. Is she actually growing food in there? What if it works? Do you think she would sell it? Emily finally looked up. Across the street, a woman stood holding grocery bags that looked unusually light. Their eyes met for a brief moment. The woman didn't smile, she didn't wave. She just looked uncertain, like she was trying to understand something she had ignored for too long. Emily didn't say anything. She simply turned back to her pond, because now she understood something clearly. The world outside was starting to look for answers, and she might be the only one who already had them. The first knock on Emily's gate didn't come at a dramatic moment. There was no storm, no warning, just a quiet afternoon that felt heavier than usual. Emily was checking the water pump when she heard it. Knock, knock. She paused, looked toward the front yard. No one usually came there anymore unless it was neighbors passing by or kids joking around, but this time it felt different. She walked slowly to the gate, and when she opened it, she saw a woman standing there, middle-aged, tired eyes, holding a small empty bag. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then the woman finally said it. "I'm sorry to bother you." Emily stayed quiet. The woman glanced down, then back up. "I live 2 streets over. I heard you have fish here." Emily didn't answer immediately, because she already understood where this was going. The woman continued, her voice breaking slightly. "The store didn't have anything today, not even basics. My kids, they haven't eaten properly since yesterday." Silence stretched between them. In that silence, everything felt real. The jokes, the laughter, the doubts, All of it suddenly felt very far away. "I'm not asking for much," the woman added quickly. "Just anything you can spare." Emily looked past her for a moment. Down the street, she could see movement. A few more people standing farther away. Watching. Waiting. Not speaking. She slowly turned back to the woman. And for the first time, Emily wasn't just a girl with a backyard project anymore. She was someone people were starting to depend on. I can't give everything," Emily said carefully. The woman nodded immediately. "Anything helps. Really." Emily stood there for a moment, thinking. Not just about the fish, but about what this meant. She had built this system for preparation, for stability, for uncertainty, and now uncertainty had arrived at her gate. She finally stepped aside slightly. "Wait here," she said softly. The woman's shoulders dropped in relief. As Emily walked back toward the pond, she noticed something she hadn't seen before. More people were now at the edge of the street. Not just one or two, several. All watching her house quietly. Some hopeful, some desperate. Some unsure of what they were even allowed to ask. Emily stopped near the pond and looked at the water. The fish moved calmly beneath the surface. Alive, growing, exactly as she had planned. But now the question wasn't whether it worked. The question was, what happens when everyone finds out it does? Behind her, she heard more footsteps approaching the gate, more knocks, more voices, and in that moment, Emily realized something that changed everything. Her backyard was no longer just her project. It had become something much bigger, something the entire town was now turning toward, and she had no idea how far it would go from here. By the next morning, Emily didn't need to wonder if people would come back. She already knew, because they did. And this time, it wasn't just one or two people. It was a line, a quiet, uneasy line forming outside her gate, like the town had slowly shifted its center toward her backyard. Some held empty bags, some held nothing at all. Most just stood in silence, waiting for a moment they weren't even sure would come. Emily stood at her kitchen window for a long time before going outside. She could see them clearly now. Neighbors, families, people who had once laughed, people who had ignored her, and people she barely knew at all waiting, all watching her house like it had become something else entirely. When she finally stepped outside, the noise dropped immediately. Not loud noise, not chaos, just anticipation. Emily walked slowly toward the gate. Every step felt heavier than the last, because she understood the reality now. This wasn't about a hobby anymore. It wasn't about proving anyone wrong. It was about responsibility. She opened the gate, and the line shifted slightly forward, like everyone had been holding their breath. A man near the front spoke first. "Is it true? You're actually growing food here?" Emily hesitated, then nodded. Yes. A wave of quiet movement passed through the crowd. Not celebration. Relief. The man exhaled like he had been carrying something heavy for days. "We don't know where else to go," another voice added from the side. "Everything is gone in the stores." Emily looked at them. Really looked. And for the first time, she saw not neighbors, not critics, but people trying to survive something they didn't fully understand. She stepped aside. "Wait here," she said again. But this time, her voice was different, more steady, more certain. She walked back toward the pond, but now she wasn't just managing a small system, she was managing demand. Carefully, she began organizing what she had. Not everything could be given away, not everything could be shared at once. She measured, she planned. She distributed small portions, carefully explaining how much the system could handle without collapsing. And something unexpected happened. The crowd didn't fight, they listened. Because even in crisis, structure creates trust. As the day went on, the line moved slowly. People received what they could. Some left quietly. Some thanked her. Some couldn't even find words, but every single one of them left with the same realization. This small backyard pond wasn't just helping, it was holding the town together. Later that evening, when the crowd finally thinned, Emily stood alone by the water again. Her hands were tired, her mind even more so. But the pond was still alive, still producing, still working. And as she looked at it, she understood something she hadn't fully accepted before. She hadn't just built a fish farm. She had built a lifeline. And now, there was no going back. By the third day, something changed outside Emily's house that she didn't expect. It wasn't just neighbors anymore. It was cars parked along the street, people holding phones, whispering, recording. What had started as quiet desperation had now turned into something larger. Attention. Emily noticed it the moment she stepped outside and saw a man filming from across the road. Another woman was speaking softly into a camera, describing what she was seeing. "I've never seen anything like this. A teenager in a small backyard, feeding the neighborhood." Emily stopped for a second, then kept walking, because she didn't have time to think about cameras. The line was longer now, and the pressure was heavier. But what surprised her most wasn't the crowd. It was how they behaved. There was no chaos, no pushing, just waiting. Like they understood that this place, this small backyard, had become something fragile, something they couldn't afford to break. Later that afternoon, a man in a clean shirt and clipboard arrived. He wasn't from the neighborhood. Emily could tell immediately. He stood near the gate, observing everything carefully. After a few minutes, he approached. "Are you Emily Carter?" She nodded cautiously. "I'm from a local food assistance coordination group," he said. "We've been hearing reports about your system here." Emily didn't respond right away, because hearing it described as a system made it feel even more real. He continued, "What you've built is stabilizing a small but growing food demand in this area. We need to understand your capacity." Emily looked at him. "My capacity is limited," she said honestly. "I can only produce so much." He nodded, writing something down. "That's exactly why we're here." For the first time, Emily felt the weight of what she had created from a different angle. Not just survival, but responsibility that others were now beginning to organize around her. As he left, more people outside the gate noticed the exchange. Whispers spread again, this time not about doubt, but about importance. "She's actually working with officials, so it's real. She's not just helping people. She's managing something bigger." That night, after the last person left, Emily sat by the pond longer than usual. The water reflected the dim porch light. Calm, steady. But her mind wasn't, because everything was changing faster than she ever planned for. She had started this to prepare for uncertainty, but now uncertainty had found her and built itself around her. And somewhere deep inside, she realized something both powerful and terrifying at the same time. This was no longer just her backyard. It was becoming the center of something much larger than she ever imagined. The morning after the officials visited, Emily expected things to calm down. They didn't. If anything, the attention outside her house grew even stronger. But something else had changed too. The way people looked at her. The jokes were gone. The doubt was gone. Even the tension had shifted into something new. Respect mixed with dependence. That morning, as Emily stepped outside, she saw something she hadn't seen before. A small group of volunteers standing near the gate, waiting quietly. One of them spoke first. "We heard you could use help managing everything." Emily looked at them for a moment, then nodded slowly, because she finally understood something important. She couldn't do this alone anymore. Not if the demand kept growing. Not if the town kept depending on her system. So she let them in. Carefully, slowly. She showed them how to feed the fish, how to monitor the water, how to organize distribution fairly, not as someone above them, but as someone holding everything together. Days turned into weeks. And the small backyard fish farm that once made people laugh had now become a structured community lifeline. People came not just for food, but to help maintain it, to protect it, to keep it running. The same neighbors who once mocked her now worked beside her, quietly, respectfully. And, over time, something shifted inside the town itself. Panic didn't disappear, but it stabilized, because stability had finally found a place to grow. One evening, as the sun set over Cedar Creek, Emily stood by the pond alone for a moment. The water reflected the orange sky. Fish moved beneath the surface, alive, steady, sustained. Behind her, she could hear people working, talking, building something together that no one had expected, a system that started as one girl's idea and became a community's survival. A voice came from behind her, one of the neighbors who once laughed the loudest. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. Emily didn't turn immediately. She just looked at the water. "I know," she said after a pause. Silence followed, not awkward, not heavy, just honest. After a moment, she finally spoke again. "I didn't do this to prove anyone wrong." She turned slightly. "I did it because I thought something might go wrong, and I didn't want to be unprepared." The man nodded slowly. "And you were right." Emily looked back at the pond. "I just didn't think it would become this big." A faint smile crossed her face. Not pride, not victory, just understanding. Because in the end, it was never about being the smartest person in the room. It was about noticing what others ignored and preparing when it mattered most. As the camera slowly pulls back from the quiet pond, the sound of the working community fades into the background. And what remains is simple: a teenage girl, a small backyard, and a system that once seemed impossible, becoming the reason an entire town didn't fall apart. And that's the story of how a small backyard fish farm turned into the lifeline of an entire town. A project that started with laughter turned into survival. And a teenage girl who was ignored by everyone became the one person who made sure others didn't give up. It makes you think, how many ideas do we laugh at every day that could actually change everything? Sometimes the people we overlook are the ones quietly building the future. If this story made you think differently, don't forget to hit the like button. Subscribe for more powerful true style stories like this. and comment below. Would you have believed Emily at the start or laughed like everyone else?